This is working. Welcome, everybody. Excellent. So my plan was to sit back and listen to Greg chair the session. Perfect. Okay, thank you. But as it turns out, Greg is not going to be here today. But I'm told that he's such a controversial guy that we're sort of better off without him being here. And Chan is going to represent him. So my name is Farid Abdullah, and I'm co-chairing this session. I'm from the Medical Research Council in South Africa, and we have a special interest in Sutezolid, not least of all because of the importance of sort of our science infrastructure when it comes to testing the new TB regimens and new drugs. We're more than aware of all the wonderful work that's happening in other countries, but we are taking an interest as newcomers to the Sutezolid issue. So, the aim of today's discussion, and it's almost better that we're a smaller group, so we can have a little more depth, would be essentially to walk, all of us through the idea of how powerful an instrument a thing like the medicines patent pool can be for tuberculosis. Now, as Chan will explain, it took a whole decade to get the medicines patent pool up to a point where it can really make a big difference on some critical issues relating to new drugs and new molecules and the market. But the subtext here is Sutezolid, so I'm hoping I will talk about it enough. So welcome once again. Without further ado, I'll ask Chan to make the first presentation.
Thank you, Farid. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chan Park. I'm the General Counsel of the Medicines Patent Pool. And today I'm going to talk about our recent entry into the field of TB. But before I do, for the benefit of the TB community who may be less familiar with our work, I thought I'd spend a few moments describing the background and history of the Medicines Patent Pool. The Medicines Patent Pool is a relatively new organization. It was created in 2010 to increase access to quality-appropriate patented medicines for people living with HIV in developing countries. It was supported by UNITAID and created by UNITAID and endorsed by the WHO and the UN General Assembly as a promising and innovative public health approach to facilitating access to patented HIV medicines in the developing world. And as a result of the successes in the first 5 years of the MPP's work in HIV, the mandate was expanded in 2015 to include 2 new disease areas, hepatitis C and tuberculosis. And the MPP remains today still fully funded by UNITAID. Oops. Yeah. So this is broad schematic of how the MPP has worked till date, at least within the context of HIV and HCV. As you'll see, this model will slightly have to be adapted as we move into our work in tuberculosis. But today what we've done is engage with the patent holders here of patented commercialized or nearly commercialized medicines to negotiate voluntary licenses on those patented medicines from a public health perspective, and then sub-license them to qualified generic manufacturers so that they can manufacture more affordable generic versions in developing countries, take 2 or more licenses together and develop appropriate fixed dose combinations for use in resource-limited settings, as well as take these licenses and do further work, further innovation on them to develop adapted formulations, for example, pediatric formulations that are specifically adapted for use in resource-limited settings. And then these generic manufacturers make them available. They compete with one another, thus driving down prices, and make it available to a wide body of people living with HIV in the developing world. And in some of our licenses, there are royalties that are specified which go back from the generic manufacturers to the patent holders themselves. Now, the concept of voluntary licensing existed before the medicines patent pool was created in 2010, and to this day there are voluntary licensing arrangements happening outside of the context of the medicines patent pool. What is the key difference, and what does the MPP bring to the table? Well, the MPP is a public health organization, so we negotiate all of our licenses with public health considerations as paramount, and I think you can see that reflected in some of the terms and conditions of our licenses. All of our licenses are non-exclusive. They're granted to multiple generic players to encourage competition and thus drive down prices for these medicines. There are provisions for tech transfer, as and when appropriate, to speedy registration, development, and ultimate access to the products. And we try to negotiate as wide a geographical scope as possible. All low and middle income countries are within our mandate, and given that it's a voluntary negotiation, some low and middle income countries may not be included, but thus far we've managed to get upwards of 110 and more developing countries, the bulk of which generally are middle income countries within the geographical scope of our licenses. This is important. All of our licenses have the flexibility to combine the licensed medicine with any other medicine to develop appropriate fixed dose combination. Now, as Fareed was mentioning earlier, this is particularly important when you look at the example of a fixed dose combination that our generic partners have recently developed and gotten FDA tentative approval for, and this is the combination of tenofovir, which is in-licensed to the medicines patent pool from Gilead Sciences, emtricitabine or lamivudine, both of which are off patent, and dolutegravir, which was recently approved and patented by ViiV. Both tenofovir and dolutegravir are within the medicines patent pool, and what our generic partners have been able to do is combine these three drugs into a single, once-daily, fixed-dose combination that is safe, robust, well-tolerated, and is now the WHO's preferred first-line medication for HIV treatment. And it's important to note that this medicine is only available as a generic, because these medicines are not available as a fixed-dose combination in high-income countries where different companies have different patents on them and they prefer to sell their own regimens. And so we're entering this interesting era where the standard of care in developing countries is in many ways superior to the standard of care that's available in high-income countries, the US, Europe, and other countries that are not included within the scope of the licenses. All of our licenses are published, and the full text of our license agreements are published on our website. And with that, the patent information relating to these drugs. Where is the drug patented? Where is it not patented, importantly? All of that information is made available on our website, injecting much lacking transparency into this field in general. And finally, all of our license agreements require that our sub-licensees receive FDA tentative approval or WHO qualification so as to ensure the quality of the products that are made under license and made available to people. So what has been the impact of MPP agreements to date? Well, we've been in HIV the longest, so we have the most agreements in HIV. We have 12 HIV medicines in license to the pool. We've more recently gotten 2 hepatitis C direct-acting antivirals into the pool. I'm going to talk more about this drug later, one tuberculosis treatment, Sutezolid, in the pool. There's over 110 ongoing pharmaceutical development projects by our generic partners, basically mixing and matching the various components in our pool to develop various fixed-dose combinations and formulations. Our licensees have distributed nearly 5 billion doses of HIV treatments to date. And this is just in HIV alone. We project by 2028 an estimated $2.3 billion in savings, meaning that for every dollar that Unitate has invested into the medicines patent pool, the global public health community saves a total of $43. So before I talk about the medicines patent pool and TB, it's important to recognize some of the key differences in the TB pipeline, as I'm sure everyone in this room is very well aware of, versus the HIV pipeline and the Hep C pipeline. In HIV, upwards of 25 new antiretroviral medicines have been approved within the last 30 years, with many more in the pipeline, many more on the way. In Hep C, the rate of innovation has been even more dramatic. Just within the last 6 years, by my count, about 14 direct-acting antivirals have been approved, and these drugs are so effective and so game-changing that development projects in phase 2 and phase 3 are being abandoned because what's actually out there is good enough. It solves the problem. It's pan-genotypic. It achieves functional cure within 8 to 12 weeks. And so you see this incredible phenomenon of pharmaceutical companies dropping out of the drug development game in Hep C, not because their drugs are inferior or in any way, but they were just too late to the game. And as we all know, the pipeline in TB is a lot more sparse. And so if the MPP were try to adapt its current way of working, seeking licenses on already approved or late phase 3 compounds into the medicines patent pool, this would be basically what we would be limited to be working on, bedaquiline and delaminid. Now, pratominid is also a very interesting drug from a clinical perspective. It's currently being developed by the TB Alliance. But from a patent perspective, this is a drug that's off patent, so less relevant to an MPP type of intervention. So necessarily as a result of this, we found ourselves having to look further upstream. And this is where we came across Sutezolid. Now, Sutezolid is in, let me pronounce this right, oxazolidinone. First developed by Pfizer, I believe, beginning in 1996, and went all the way up to phase 2A trials before Pfizer exclusively licensed its rights to a company called Sequela. Unfortunately, since 2013, there's been no further significant development work on Sutezolid, and thus it's just been stalled in development. The underlying patent situation for Sutezolid is interesting. Although the original compound patent that was patented by Pfizer expired in 2014, there's a subsequent patent jointly owned by Johns Hopkins University and Pfizer that covers the use of Sutezolid in combination with other TB agents. Now, Pfizer, as I just mentioned, exclusively licensed its share of its rights on that combination patent to Sequela, but Johns Hopkins had not yet licensed its rights on that same patent. And in November of last year, the Johns Hopkins University agreed to license its rights in this combination patents to the medicines patent pool. Some of the key terms in the agreement: it's a worldwide exclusive royalty-free license. The MPP has the right to grant sublicenses to any entity with the willingness and capacity to develop and commercialize. The MPP is required to include some diligence and development milestones in any sublicense agreements that it issues for further development, and to ensure that whatever products are ultimately developed, that they meet certain accessibility standards that are defined in the agreement. And as you'll hear in the next session, this license would not have happened had it not been for the tireless campaigning of various civil society organizations, including Universities Allied for Essential Medicines, MSF, Treatment Action Group, and others. And you'll hear a lot more about that in the next session, so I won't say anymore. Shortly after the in-license from the Johns Hopkins University, we issued our first sublicense agreement to the TB Alliance on a worldwide non-exclusive royalty-free basis. It contains the same accessibility provisions that are contained in the main agreement between Johns Hopkins and the medicines patent pool. And as in all of our agreements, it contains the requirement that if the product is ever commercialized, that it meet certain strict patent quality standards, WHO pre-qualification, and stringent regulatory authority approval. Importantly, there are also provisions that require the sublicensee to meet good stewardship practices so that the drug is used appropriately and that resistance doesn't develop sooner than we would like it to for this new drug that's developed. There's a most favored licensee clause, which is kind of legalese, but it basically means that the Medicines Patent Pool commits to treating all of its licensees, including the TB Alliance, and any other future licensees that we may have, on an equal footing, on an equal basis. We will not provide preferential treatment to one licensee over the other. And as required in the main license, certain development timelines are specified. Commitment to enter into phase 1 studies by 1st of November 2017. This has already been done. TB Alliance has entered into phase 1. Phase 2 by March 2019, phase 3 by Jan 2021, and a targeted SRA approval by December 2024. Importantly, although this has not yet been finalized or formally announced yet, I can share with this group that there is an MOU that will be announced in the coming days between the TB Alliance and MPP on product and data sharing for Sutezolid. Through this MOU, the TB Alliance has committed to making the Sutezolid drug product available to any other researcher that would like to investigate the use of Sutezolid in its own clinical trials. And as long as they have a credible trial protocol, TB Alliance agrees to make the drug product available to those third parties, as well as a commitment to share all of the preclinical and clinical data that it generates as it moves forward with Sutezolid. TB Alliance commits to making that data available to third parties as long as that third party also agrees to agree to the same data sharing principles. Right? So all of these commitments, the commitment to pool IP through the Medicines Patent Pool, the commitment to pool data, this open collaborative framework is consistent with the principles embodied in the Life Prize, which we'll hear more about at the end of today's session. The MPP is a founding steering committee member, and once the Life Prize is up and running, the MPP will serve as a repository for all IP necessary for development and ultimate equitable access to the new regimens developed under the framework. And just this week, we announced a collaboration with Otsuka aimed at making pediatric formulations of Delaminid available and accessible to children. It includes an element of exploring possible licensing arrangements following Otsuka's successful development of a pediatric dispersible tablet formulation of Delaminid. And importantly, the MOU notes that it's a first step towards a possible broader collaboration, that the parties agreed to explore future areas of collaboration. So we view this as a small but important step in collaborating with a key player in the field of TB research and development. So before I finish, I just want to leave everyone with this policy tripod, which forms the basis of the discussions ongoing at the World Health Organization in the combat against antimicrobial resistance, of which obviously TB is a key element. And it focuses on three areas that are equally important and equally important to address as we combat antimicrobial resistance, including anti-TB resistance. And it recognizes that there is a dire need to inject a lot more investment into the development of new antimicrobials. But as these development projects are proceeding, once the products are successfully developed, we need to keep both access and stewardship considerations in mind. Ensure that everyone who needs access to these medicines have it, but that these medicines are responsibly deployed so that resistance doesn't develop. So this represents a shift in the MPP's thinking, because in Hep C and HIV, we had focused primarily on the access component, but as the MPP's work in TB moves further upstream and stewardship considerations downstream become equally important, we will have to take all three aspects of the policy tripod into account. Thank you.
Thanks, Chan. There's a lot of complexity in this whole kind of MPP story. So I think, at least for the speakers and myself, to get a little bit of a sense of what's the most important message to get across to you. I want to just open it up for a few questions at this stage to Chan, or for any comments. Go ahead.
Mike Gregory from Action Group. Can you comment on whether the stewardship part of your TB licenses, is that a part of the licenses that you have for HIV or hepatitis or resistant might also be a concern, although patterned in different ways?
Right.
And how you thought through structuring that for TB?
Yeah. Yeah, so well, we actually published a stewardship report specifically for TB, and I can send you the link for that, where it describes more of our thinking on how to approach stewardship while not sacrificing access, right? And because access is also a very critical consideration for the MPP as it moves forward. I would say that there are stewardship-related considerations already included in many of our licenses. Quality is one of them. You know, we want to make sure that the right amount of active ingredient is included in every single pill that our manufacturers produce. There are pharmacovigilance provisions already contained in some of our licenses which are relevant to quality. You know, manufacturing standards so as to make sure that, you know, effluents don't leak into the environment so as to create, you know, reservoirs of resistance, as the O'Neill report described. So there are certain aspects related to stewardship that we're already doing in our Hep C and HIV licenses. I think there are TB-specific considerations to take into account. I should point out that in the TB Alliance sublicense, there are not specific provision saying you shall do this, you shall do that, because, you know, commercialization is still several years away now, and we want to be able to make sure that we incorporate the latest learnings with regard to stewardship and access. So there is a commitment, a future commitment, to take into account the best practices relating to stewardship if and when the product is ultimately commercialized.
We'll just go in this direction, you next, and then Paula.
Hi.
Okay, thank you. I wanted to ask a question about the lack of manufacturing capacity in a lot of our settings. And, you know, it's brilliant to have these beautiful licenses, but if you don't have generic manufacturers to make the drugs, then you're really just sitting with these licenses. And I wanted to know whether or not you had any thoughts to that, and whether, I don't know, I don't actually know why I'm asking you this question, but whether anybody in this room actually had thoughts about that, because what does a license do if you can't manufacture the drugs?
Yeah, no, we actually have a number of sub-licensees. I believe I showed in one of my or on one of my slides, over 110 development projects that are currently being conducted by our licensees. We have, I forget the last count, it might be 12, it might be more, forgive me. Thus far, they have been predominantly based in India because that is, you know, frankly, where the manufacturing base for the generic industry, particularly in HIV, exists today. We also have a few sub-licensees in China, as well as, you know, American companies. We recently signed a sub-license agreement with Sandoz, which is a European company. We are looking to expand the geographical base of our sub-licensees. The one challenge that exists is for local manufacturers that only want to produce locally. We are required under our MOU with Unitaid to have all of our licensees meet these strict quality criteria. FDA tentative approval, WHO pre-qualification. For many of these local manufacturers, that presents an almost insurmountable or just a not economically feasible obstacle. So that is one challenge to keep in mind.
Hi, Paula Fujiwara from the Union. Thank you for this brilliant presentation. And the question is, I mean, how receptive, as you've moved forward with even before TB, is pharma receptive to this whole concept of, you know, sharing their patents?
Well, yeah, I mean, we were established in 2010, and it took a while for the pharmaceutical industry to recognize that we were our model was inherently collaborative and not confrontational, right? We weren't saying, give us your patents or else. We were saying, let's sit down and talk about the ways in which you can contribute towards universal access to HIV medicines.
But they started on a confrontational basis.
Yeah, and then and there were some early rocky periods, but now, I mean, we basically either had a direct license or collaborated in facilitating access to all of the HIV manufacturers that have ARVs on the WHO, patented ARVs on the WHO recommendation list.
Yes, Chan. Wim van der Velde, and perhaps as a member of the advisory group I should know this, but I'm going to ask it anyway. The MOU between the TB Alliance and the patent pool regarding the product and data sharing of Sutezolid, could you perhaps elaborate a bit on what that means for any generic company or country who comes knocking at the door? Is it open access for everybody, or will there be a committee reviewing that, and where should that committee be hosted?
Well, so for the product sharing, the MOU contemplates the TB Alliance setting up a steering committee, of which the MPP will also be a member. Through the MOU, the TB Alliance is inviting the MPP to serve on the steering committee, along with any number of other stakeholders in the field. It's very early days, so that the structure and governance rules of that steering committee has yet to be determined, but there is, primarily a commitment on the part of TB Alliance to actually make that happen. And for data sharing, that's not necessarily governed by the steering committee necessarily, but the TB Alliance wants to make sure that anyone who gives data to also commits to the same type of data pooling principle, so as to further propagate the principles embodied in the life press.
Do you want to follow up, Wim? No. I mean, so that was a nice thread of questions, right? Now, I'll kind of offer some comments. So it's all a very happy story now. But when it started out, it was just war, okay? Especially in places like South Africa, where the whole pharma industry went to war against the whole of the government and the activists. Places like India, and the world was divided between those who said, we can't produce drugs if we don't get paid to recoup our R&D costs. And the good guys who said, you're just all capitalist dogs, and what we need is health before profits. And that's where it started off, and to reach a point now where there's very cordial conversations between tall white men in suits and activists in t-shirts saying HIV positive. And I think that's the wonderful story of the MPP, that it converted that confrontation into a system that seems to work for everybody. And I'm not sure that everyone has done all the calculations exactly right, because it's a little hard to understand why a big pharma would give up a license for a small royalty. But the kind of simple explanation is that when you take volumes into account, this can work for everybody financially. Yes.
Are we going to have to start all over with the TB medicines? There are not many yet, but do you think we'll have to start all over? Is the same companies? Or?
It's largely different companies, I will say that. And we will have to start over, and we'll have to approach it from a different manner. And I think, I think your presentation will touch upon how if we are going further upstream and looking to not only gain access to these compounds for equitable access, but to spur additional investment and to spur research and development into these drugs done in the right way from the beginning, right? And so that regimens are developed and not individual compounds in silos, then the nature of the conversation will inherently have to change with these companies as well. And it won't be limited to companies, or not the traditional large multinational pharmaceutical companies. They will still be relevant for sure, but if you're looking at phase 1 compounds, you're also looking at universities and biotechs and various other entities that will also become relevant stakeholders to reach out to.
And I guess the point of this session is, to introduce the TB community to a mechanism that has gone through so many stages of development and can now offer an instruments to, assist the TB sort of drug market. Having said that, your question was a good one about generic companies, and generic companies sort of have been very smart at playing themselves off as the poor, good guys who really want to do this. They've made a lot of money out of it. And they are all in India, China, or South Africa. So, you have to accept that a lot of countries in Africa which will be using these drugs will not benefit from local production for a range of reasons. So that's a compromise that, you have to make in all of this. But there are some differences too. For instance, the market dynamics for TB drugs are completely different on a global scale to HIV drugs. The US has 1 million patients who need HIV drugs. It's not quite the same, for tuberculosis.
Which is precisely why this pipeline is so sparse, right? So.
Right. I think we've gotten to the bottom of what you want to convey. But I do think that we want to also show up the differences between the TB drug world and the HIV drug world, and perhaps to talk to some of the points that have been raised about. It's a good point to ask Meredith Basie to talk about how the battle on Sutezolid kind of unfolded. So over to you. Chan, can I pass over to her? Of course. Thank you. I'll keep this one.
Let's see. Okay, do you know how to? Hi, my name is Meredith Basie, and I'm the executive director for a non-profit organization called Universities Allied for Essential Medicines, one of those very nice, long, catchy names that NGOs seem to give themselves, UAEM. It doesn't roll off the tongue very easily. Our tagline is, "We have a drug problem," and most people seem to remember that a little bit better. And your point about our starting point today, I think the health before profit is the angle that really I'll be taking today, this afternoon. UAM is mostly a student-driven organization. We have 100 chapters in over 20 different countries, including India and Brazil. So let's see. So I know we've heard a little bit about the medicines patent pool this morning, but I thought if I'm going to talk about university licensing in this context, I would explain a little bit of the basics, because I'm not sure if everybody knows. So just to start here, basically a patent is really something, the right to exclude others from making or using or selling an innovation, and a license or licensing really gives permission to that other user. In this case, it would be a pharmaceutical company or a biotech to use that patented innovation. And in this context, what I'll be talking about is universities as the patent holders. And what we focus on really is the patents and licenses that are really going to affect, that will save lives, that are health, life-saving innovations, technologies, all of the things sort of listed here, and also focusing primarily on these innovations that are funded by the taxpayer. So just to sort of break this down again, I'm sure this doesn't have a timeline of many years, but it's a very simple breakdown of what you might expect in terms of a university, the cycle of a drug developed at a university. So you see on the top left, obviously you've got public money. This is usually coming in sort of university grants. This may be the NIH, for example, coming to the university where basic research is carried out. And in that process, there may be this identification of promising molecules that will be brought forward for further research. If things are looking good, like we're going to talk about Sutezolid, then there may be this opportunity to license, if there's interest from somewhere else, a biotech or a pharmaceutical corporation, to come in and essentially license this patented innovation from the university. What this might mean is the university can get royalties in that process, and the pharmaceutical corporation has the right to take that forward. And depending on the product, etc., it will look a little bit different depending on how far they take it at the university level, but that's basically the starting point. Oops. So, why should we all care about university licensing? Fundamentally, it's because licenses determine who will have access to the innovations developed. Again, with taxpayer dollars usually, and who won't. So this, we've heard about a little bit about exclusive versus non-exclusive licenses. You know, we would be advocating for non-exclusive licenses, which I'll explain in a second, and recognizing the massive amount of money that is coming from the public every year. In the United States, it's $34 billion. They're the biggest public funder of research, global research and development in the world. And a lot of that money is not just going to the US, it's going internationally as well for a lot of the work that a lot of us in this room care about. And we see this as a sort of an upstream opportunity to tackle the affordability and availability problem of access to life-saving drugs, technologies, this kind of thing. So it's before we get down to the final product and having that massive debate about drug pricing, which we're actually seeing now increasingly all over the world in all sorts of different contexts. I should note here, the majority of TB drugs have a university research component, almost all vaccines, if not 100%, and I think it's a quarter to a half now of HIV/AIDS drugs as well. So it does matter, and the decisions made by universities matter. And what we do as well is try and hold those universities accountable for what we believe, in theory, is their social missions, what they were set out for in the first place, rather than to care about primarily shareholder value. So what UAM does, and what we've done now for 15 years, since 2001, we have organized students on campuses at research universities to lobby their technology transfer offices, these TTOs. That's the sort of group that manages the licensing of these products to get them out to biotechs or pharma to adopt these policies that will protect access to medicines. And we do that around this framework called the Global Access Licensing Framework that you can find on our website. And really it's about making sure that those innovations are available equitably for all. There's also other mechanisms, some of these things you may have heard of, or universities are quite familiar with, the SPS, the Statement of Principles and Strategies. And again, these are sort of steps that universities can take to say that they are living up to their social missions, but also that they're going to license in a way that is going to assure access down the line. So for those of you who are involved with HIV/AIDS, will certainly be familiar with this story, but this is the sort of angle that that applies to university licensing. You know, back in 2001, the height of the crisis, many people, millions of people dying in South Africa. MSF, Doctors Without Borders, were looking to treat people living with HIV for the first time, and they had identified, in combination with other drugs, this drug, Stavudine, or D4T. It was about $10,000 a year in combination, which was obviously too expensive for MSF to be able to treat the millions of people they wanted to treat. But they had identified that this drug had been developed at Yale University with taxpayer money, And it happened to be that one of their young activists was about to start Yale Law School in that fall of 2001. And Amy Kapczynski is her name. She decided that she was going to work, obviously, with MSF and other civil society actors to urge the university to change the license they had with this pharmaceutical giant, Bristol Myers Squibb. And initially, the university said, absolutely not. This is crazy. How could we possibly change a license? But after actually quite quickly, some very bad press for Yale University, and we all know that universities do not like bad press, especially Yale, and some articles in the New York Times, this kind of thing. And this is Dr. Prusov. He is the chap that discovered the drug, or led a lot of that research, and his take on this. And so quite quickly the university then decided to keep the students quiet, amongst other things. They would change this license. So the license was changed, and this enabled South Africa, amongst a lot of other sort of civil society organizing, and a lot was happening at this time. But this piece with the university was that it meant that there was it helped trigger essentially a 90% reduction in the price of that drug in combination, and it meant that South Africa could not only legally produce the drug, but they could import it as well. And MSF were able to treat people living with HIV for the first time in the country. So this was Amy back then. For the record, like what we tell our students as well is she's actually a law professor now at Yale, so it actually, despite all of her activism, she was certainly rewarded for it, although it didn't look pretty at the time. That was one of the articles from the New York Times, but there were these questions about whether or not this was going to impact the university, whether that it was going to impact R&D, what were the sort of medicines that were going to come out as a result of this sort of groundbreaking change. But the reality was, even the university admitted a couple of years later that they didn't actually lose any money on this because they weren't thinking about the South African market at that time. So just to sort of summarize, this is the sort of global access licensing in a broken down in a slide, but basically to recognize that what this non-exclusive license would do would ensure essentially that either that the patents wouldn't be enforced in high-income countries like the United States, but it would allow for countries like South Africa or India to make the generics or illegally import them, but the company wouldn't be enforcing patents in those countries. And sort of similar to what Chan was talking about earlier. But obviously that's simplified, but yeah. So these are sort of and there's a lot of text, I apologize. But I at least put it on one slide rather than two. This is really what we are going for in terms of goals with this framework that we are urging universities and other research institutes to adopt. So really, the primary purpose that we want to see is that they are protecting access to these innovations. Secondly, making sure that intellectual property or IP doesn't act as a future barrier to research. We know that generic competition is the most effective method for reducing price, basically. And so this is a priority for us as well. Also making sure, we heard about follow-on patents, data exclusivity. Chan was talking a little bit about sharing of data. This is really important here. Making sure that that data, as we see with Sutezolid as well, when I come to that you see that that information can be shared so that other researchers can advance more quickly, and also not repeat clinical trials unnecessarily, unethical, etc. And that these university technology transfer programs do try to encourage these non-exclusive licenses. So we don't want to see them patenting in low and middle income countries. But now the challenge that we're seeing, as you've seen the high drug prices in Europe, in the United States, all around the world, this is going to be an increasing challenge for us as well, because I think we haven't tackled that problem in high-income countries, and this piece will not do that. And finally, transparency, again, echoing what Chan said, this is really a key piece for all of our work, and its potential access and affordability of medicines. So the Hopkins story and Sutezolid.
You have 5 minutes.
Okay, there's only a couple of slides left. So obviously you know about the Sutezolid, this promising MDR-TB drug. As Chan mentioned, the patent had expired in 2014, but Pfizer, Sequela, and Johns Hopkins still had secondary patents. And the license, what Johns Hopkins was going to license, they were going to license this to Sequela, this biotech company that hadn't actually advanced Sutezolid in the prior years. And so we felt very strongly, along with our partners at MSF Access Campaign, TAG, and TB-CAB, that this was going to be negative for access, and that we couldn't afford this drug to be stalled for more years going forward. So basically, it finishes with JHU licensing to JHU licensing to the medicines patent pool, but in between there was 2 years of campaigning to the university, showing up, getting Stephen Lewis to call the president of Johns Hopkins University, getting students to sit outside his office, meeting with the technology transfer office's public petitions, creative actions on the campus to say, look, we are paying attention, we want to hold you accountable. You also have this Bloomberg School of Public Health, and you need to stand up for what you say that you believe in. And if you really care about advancing this for people living with TB, we can't wait anymore. We've already waited too long with Sequela. You have to act, and you have to do the right thing. And it did work, but it took some time. And there's still, we would have, I think, as a coalition, would have wanted to go even further with some of the terms in the agreement, but it's certainly a very important step forward to help open up access to this drug in combination. As Chan mentioned, there's already been a license to TB, a sub-license to TB Alliance. And as another piece that is worth mentioning here is that still Sequela and Pfizer have the rights to, they won't open up the data to what they already, in terms of the clinical trial data that they had already carried out. And this is something that we're still pushing as a group to ensure that they open up this data so we don't have to repeat trials unnecessarily. But in a nutshell, I think we believe that these are really important goals that any university, but also research institutes, especially anything that's publicly funded, we're also advocating at the NIH level so that they strengthen the conditions they attach to university licensing so that, even more upstream, the conditions that universities have to receive that money are around ensuring that the final product will be accessible and affordable. And I will leave you with, I think, this quote, one of our advisory board members, and I think it's sort of the starting and ending point for me today, but I think we need to think about this increasingly as we go forward, not just in TB, but in access to medicines as a movement as well. So thank you.
Thank you. Well, that was excellent. I mean, both the stories of Yale and Johns Hopkins, and I'm glad you ended on the point you did, because it's a perfect opportunity for you to get into the data sharing issue, which at the university level they were not able to resolve. So I'll ask Deborah Hanna to join us.
Great. So good afternoon. I'll introduce myself. I'm Deborah Hanna. I am part of an organization called the Critical Path Institute. While he's pulling up the slides here, we're a nonprofit organization and foundational to the work that support high unmet medical need therapeutic areas. My particular position at Critical Path Institute is leading our TB initiative, which is the Critical Path to TB Drug Regimens effort that's funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And the reason that I'm here and part of this program is that Critical Path Institute is one of those founding steering committee members of the Life Prize that you've heard about. And we're here to support the data collaboration needs and to encourage and provide assurance and confidence with those who would be sharing data with us that we will be really good stewards of not only the TB community, but those who are contributing data. So why is data collaboration important? I think this is something I probably don't have to spend a lot of time on in this group. You know, the Sutezolid story that we've heard a lot about today is a really good example. So had data been shared early on, whether it was from Pfizer or from Sequela, right, TB Alliance wouldn't be needing to do some repetitive studies. Now this is easier said than done, right? There are some real concerns that those who are developing drugs where they have patents, really have to be mindful of when they can share data, especially when they have ongoing trials moving towards regulatory approval. And we understand those sensitivities, but at the end of the day, this problem is real. Right now, we've taken now 4 years to advance Sutezolid. Not much has been done, and we were starting again from ground zero in the TB community. So there's a problem with that, and you stall development paths. So I would say we've lost more than 4 years because now we're repeating work that we know lays within the walls of individual organizations. The really, really good news is that there's increasing awareness, and I would say through my experience of CPTR, there's an increased willingness to share data. I think a lot of the concerns about people will poach my information, people will publish outside of my important publications, really hasn't come to fruition. And so it's my hope that the history that we've built within CPTR and Critical Path Institute will help lift and elevate the Life Prize forward, specifically around data collaboration. So to talk specifically about the Life Prize data sharing needs, the goal is to incentivize the sharing of data with its collaborators, and this is going to require establishing a common and secure mechanism for sharing knowledge. This is something that Critical Path Institute has already built. It has already built this protective mechanism specifically for TB clinical trial data. And I will say, I think one of the ideas about Critical Path being part of this initiative is that this community can leverage the resources that have already been invested in generating the platform as it stands. And so we're also not duplicating the addition of resources to stand up new data platforms. It's very important that standardizing data happens so that we can meet regulatory authorities' expectations. Chan talked about one of the requirements of the medicine patent pool is that you are running regulatory stringent quality clinical trials. And at least for the Food and Drug Administration, there are specific therapeutic area data standard that needs to be employed when you're running TB clinical trials. CPTR helped develop that with CDISC. That's already implemented in the platform that would be made available to the Life Prize. And also that we provide guidance regarding the preferred format for data from early preclinical pipeline. We talked about this is not just about sharing clinical data. Had that knowledge from the preclinical space been shared, we might be designing trials differently today. So the objective of the data sharing components for the Life Prize is really to catalyze future innovations in TB therapeutics. And I think many of these are self-explanatory but worth punctuating in public, right? Increase publicly available data for researchers. So this wouldn't just be data that would be held within the confines of a couple different companies or developers. It would be made publicly accessible. To improve decision-making for those drug developers actively working in clinical trials or regimen development trials in the space. To accelerate registration of final regimens with standardized data format. You're going to hear me repeat that over and over, but when we talk about data sharing, it's not just about the data from a single drug being shared. There's incredible power when you can aggregate data across multiple clinical trials, and we want to see that come to life in the Life Prize data sharing space. We want to see the field optimize novel regimens, and lastly, to facilitate meta-analyses to synthesize data for future global guidelines, market access analyses, or other scientific data analysis projects. So again, not just about a single data set related to Sutezolid for one developer. It's how we can aggregate those data across multiple different trials and across multiple different drugs. CPATH, as I've mentioned, is a steering committee member and a founder of the Life Prize, and we will host the Life Prize data platform to enable data sharing. Part of what we do is not just to architect the data platform, which I've shared with you is already done, but we're also operationalizing this. And part of being a steward of especially patient-level clinical trial data is that we have to follow all those protective guidelines and principles to keep that patient-level data safe. And part of convincing groups to share data, like from the Sutezolid trials, is to make them fully confident that we will follow all those guidelines and regulations just as they would in their own data repositories. So we provide data use agreements. We have a clear outline of how we've done this with many, many organizations over the past 11 years, but the steering committee will have some review and say in what this data contribution agreement looks like. We manage the transfer and curation of data, so it's the people power behind actually how you build a very useful and fruitful data platform. That we must provide stewardship of this database, and not just for a year or 2 years, but for the perpetuity of this project and beyond. And to develop this common database, we are going to leverage one that we've already built in partnership with the World Health Organization. Right now, this data platform called TB, Platform for the Aggregation of Clinical Trials, right? So another one of those lengthy words we've built into the acronym TB PACS, has been developed so that we can aggregate the phase 3 fluoroquinolone-containing trials. We'll use that similar structure and hopefully continue to aggregate beyond just those 3 studies. So I won't go into as much depth maybe on some of these more technical slides, but I am happy to answer these questions, because if you're really one of those groups that wants to be involved in this program, these are all the questions you're going to have, right? We have a data collaboration center that I've mentioned. It's over 11 years strong. We have 12 collaborations in different therapeutic areas, and we focus on all of those specific topics that I shared with you, and we emphasize here really strongly again the importance of the CDISC clinical trial data standard, which is already been developed for TB. It is made publicly accessible, and we can even work with different groups if they need training on how to implement that data standard. And all that means is when you run a clinical trial, you're aggregating those data or collecting those data as prescribed by that standard, and when you put it together with lots of other data, you can look for commonalities. So our data sharing principles, and I think these are really important to share, especially in the context of the TB community, right? Respect, inclusivity, and stewardship on this slide. So data access and use will adhere to international standards of human subjects research and will support the applicable regulations for data privacy, security, and intellectual property rights. Critically important, again, when we're talking about patient-level data. Inclusivity, so when applicable, efforts will be made to request data contributions that are geographically diverse, high and low burden areas, to ensure adequate representation of clinical variants from different geographic settings, obviously very important in this field, and data sets will be made accessible to the broader scientific community, which has been a presiding principle over our TB PACS data platform. So in terms of stewardship, our processes will be set in place to preserve data integrity, ensure traceability, transparency, and accountability, and that is incredibly important. This is not just going to be a common repository or a data dump. We have to understand everything about how these data have been managed and make sure we're appropriately stewarding those data. The last 2 really important principles here, collaboration, so data from multiple sources will be standardized, you've heard me say it over and over, and aggregated to enable and facilitate a deeper understanding of TB drug development across multiple different trials. Data access capabilities will allow for broad sharing of data to facilitate research that promotes the development of new therapies and new development tools. Promoting the common good, I think that stands for itself and is a critical principle that underpins the Life Prize. So some of you, if you're familiar with data collaboration, will understand the FAIR guiding principles for scientific data, and I've been asked this question before and want to make sure that you understand we will follow the FAIR principles with this particular data repository. Those data must be findable, accessible, must be interoperable. So if we are trying to interconnect with other data repositories, that we're able to partner in that way. And the data provenance is such that those data can be reusable over time. I don't need to go into this graphic, but I've spared you another text slide, so hopefully that's a positive. Just to give you a visual of how all of this works, and most importantly on the left side here, contribution of contributed data is going to be managed through what we call a data contribution agreement, and that's the legal framework that says how we're going to protect the rights of those contributing data. I think the Life Prize has made very clear what the terms will be around data collaboration and data sharing, but that would be managed by Critical Path Institute as the neutral entity. So you can juxtapose that to another model whereby individual drug developers may want to develop a drug on their own, maintain the data in their own data repository, and then share via their own steering committee. So there are pros and cons to both approaches. I would say one con is that you don't have the potential to do that data aggregation over time across multiple studies. So I'll end here to just say again that we have some experience in this space, and the reason that Critical Path Institute was chosen is because there has been major investment by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, partnerships with the World Health Organization and TDR to already architect a framework that can be leveraged here. And I just want to end on the note that when we talk about limited resources in drug development, it's not just the drug and the development piece as well, it's that data curation, that data management piece that we also want to maximize. So we have multiple data programs within the Critical Path to TB Drug Regimens program. Jerry Davies has just joined us today, and we will be working hopefully to aggregate some data across both the Predict TB program and CPTR as well, and just to say that it can be done. So for those who think we're never going to get collaborators to share data and that you can't do it, we've already done it. Now the challenge is to work on some of these newer drugs. So with that, I will say thank you and answer any questions.
I will take a couple of questions on both of the last presentations. We will come to the room, and I will pass the microphone around. And I'm very happy to see you.
Thank you. My question is for Deborah. I think it's a great presentation. Do you see a role for the Critical Path Institute in the further development of Sutezolid as data something? Given the fact that Life Prize is also hopefully involved in the development.
So if you attended, I think you were at the Sutezolid meeting the other day. Yes. We would certainly love those data to be contributed to the platform that will be used for the Life Prize. Again, I think the value and the power of that is that you have a neutral group, which will be covered by a well-represented, broadly represented steering committee that can share data beyond one specific institution. And again, I have the longer view in mind, understanding why the TB Alliance is very focused on their immediate game. I fully appreciate that. But the longer view is that more and more data sets are going to come forward, and aggregating those data can be incredibly powerful for learning lessons learned with clinical trials. And so we would love to start with that as the example of the first data contribution from TB Alliance, but that remains to be seen. Wait for the mic, Klaus.
I'm not going to give you the microphone.
Okay, thank you.
I'll give you the microphone once I'm done with my little bit. So I can't help but thinking, and I almost want to force you all to close your eyes and imagine if the Life Prize had been in effect, in existence 5 years ago. Would we have a new regimen with bedaquiline, with protominid, or actually not protominid, sorry, with delaminid, with Sutezolid? And I think yes. Do you know how many countries out of the high burden countries bedaquiline still isn't registered in? Guess. 11. Do you know how many high burden countries delaminid still isn't registered in? 25. If they didn't care if we had gotten the Life Prize to facilitate these compounds going into the medicines patent pool, we could already have these drugs registered. We could also, Life Prize could have pushed the developers, could have pushed earlier for a DDI with bedaquiline delaminid. Instead, MSF were using it off-label. To good effect, if you saw the late breaker data today. Also, Sutezolid, dying on the vine since 2013 is ridiculous. So if we ever think about the benefits of the Life Prize and what it could bring, then to consider what we've already lost in terms of time to have what could be an optimal regimen. Now you could have the mic.
Yeah, thank you. So the one thing that I would add to what Deborah mentioned, back to your point, is that through CPTR we provide to any sponsor, anyone, developing drugs for TB or regimens, the tools to optimize the process. So Sutezolid would not be an exception. Just like we have put out the tools for Janssen and Otsuka to use for their programs, this would not be an exception. And they can make use of all the tools that we've developed, and we will finish up developing over the next year for use for all sponsors to optimize the design of clinical trials to evaluate these drugs.
I can't resist a comment here just to follow on what Sharon Ann was saying, and that is that, Sutezolid is unique in that with one more drug in the mix, you just have so many more options.
Yes.
And, we're just hearing now all the proposals from so many researchers about how they would put it into different combinations. And I do think that we have been set back by the story. Having said that, what you've heard up to this point, and you complete the picture with your presentation, is a whole approach. There is another horse in this race using a more traditional approach, and that is, with Sequela and Aurum now wanting to take this product to registration, and in a way, Chan, it's a step forward that, regardless of the two initiatives, the one thing that has been sorted is the licensing. And now the attention has shifted to the sharing of data. And I do think that becomes a critical discussion in resolving this. But I also want to say, just be careful we don't put all our hopes on one drug.
Yeah.
That the process is more important. There was a hand here somewhere, was there? Nope. Okay. Well, with that, I wanted to ask you a question, which is, what's the role of your kind of activism in addressing this issue of data sharing?
Well, I'm glad you asked. Well, I think, we were talking about this committee. We advocate for open access. We also collaborate with a lot of organizations who have urged institutions like the NIH to make sure that this kind of thing. I think when we were hearing about the committee that TB Alliance is forming, I think this is where I'm wondering whether UAM should be playing a role again. I don't know how much of a conflict of interest potentially this could be, given that it's not clear why that has to happen at that level and not at the MPP level. And I think as an organization that is outside, we have the power potentially to urge you to do something differently. But I do think it's like every step of the way it's been a fight, and it shouldn't be that way. And there'll be another fight. There's going to be more for the right outcome.
The universities who you engage in are sort of the knowledge production houses of the world, right? And the culture there is not to share data, even within a university. So you might have a little more difficulty with that issue than just getting a license. But I want to ask Sharon Ann, to come
I
back.
will say while you're waiting for Sharon Ann, I do think the question is as well is around universities and whether or not we want these institutions to become corporations and just to behave like corporations and the pharmatization of universities. I think this is a space that is becoming occupied by the power of big institutions that don't necessarily have the interests of people at their heart.
You see, there's a stigma here. And the stigma is that when people hear about data sharing, they think of it as data socialism, you know? And, well, socialism is a little outdated, and all of us have spent too much time with it, right? And the point is to make the case for how data sharing will move things forward faster and better. But I wanted to ask you to talk a little bit about the voucher, the priority review voucher, and whether that isn't a perverse incentive in this whole dynamic.
My lord. So the priority review voucher, for those that don't know, is a U.S. innovation. It's meant to be a carrot, or is it a stick? Definitely a carrot, to incentivize people to address otherwise unaddressed medical needs. So for pediatric, for example, for neglected diseases. And so the issue with Sutezolid is essentially whoever's first past the post with the FDA approved gets the priority review voucher. Now, the priority review voucher allows you to jump the queue in the FDA to get expedited approval. Now, this matters hugely because if you get the FDA PRV, the priority review voucher, you could apply it to any commodity. You could apply it to, you know, the next, I don't mean to be looking over here, but the next male pattern baldness medicine, for example. You could also sell it. So we know the value of this sucker. It has been sold for as much as $350 million. $350 million. So when we're worried, I mean, so unfortunately the PRV is also, in the case of Sutezolid, it has been around for a while, whether it's a true innovation, you know, so there are some problems with the PRV, but in this case, what Farid is pointing out, it's distorting the field. And when we first asked Carol to provide the data for the clinical trial that they had carried out for phase 1, the response that we got back was essentially, this is a valuable drug, we're gonna hit it up against a lot of regimens, a lot of pathologies, we're not gonna give it up. She didn't say that in so many words, but that was essentially the response. So the question is, you guys, right now, for whoever has Sutezolid, they don't have secured funding. So what then?
I like Sharon Ann. She always says exactly what I want her to say.
Yeah, so I can't resist commenting that, you know, I don't think socialism is an outdated concept, particularly in this forum, because socialism is about the sharing of assets, is it not? And sharing them for the public good. And I think the comment about universities is very interesting because there is a tendency, even in the UK, towards the commercialisation of universities and control of IP, but our experience actually in the data sharing area has been very positive. And I think that has something to do with the fact that we're a relatively small field and many of us know each other. Usually we all fit in about a room this size. And you know, we have been successful in getting people to sign up to sharing data, some of which is relatively new, within a defined time frame. I think that's perfectly possible. I think we've shown that it can be done. And I think we shouldn't be afraid of saying the S word. You know, I think, you know, we are talking about a completely different model of drug development, and actually a model of drug development that could lead the way in the antibacterial and antiviral field, because the public health case is strong, and to be perfectly frank, the market is non-existent.
The big pharma share their data. They just pay all the clinical trial sites all over the world enough money to make sure that, you know, all the data is put into some central repository. But I think that's a nice point at which we can sort of ask Paula to talk about the Life Prize. Because interestingly, Sharon, and I don't know if you agree with me, it's the same underlying principle, right? So put a financial incentive in front of the people who need to do this and it'll work. But I think you'd be interested to see how Life Prize might be a little different. over to you.
Thank you. I'm Paula Fujiwara. I'm the scientific director of the union, and I'm actually presenting on behalf of Dr. Grania Brigden, who's at a very important meeting on AMR in Berlin. So she asked me to do this for her, and it's been great to hear all this, because I consider myself a newbie on this, and I've learned an incredible amount just sitting in this session. And we've heard the word life prize, life prize, life prize, life prize. And for those of you who've been in this for a long time, this was formerly called the 3P project: push, pull, and pool. So, so this is, I think the trumpet should be dun da da da. I will now present the life prize. Okay, so we've heard a lot of this in different concepts. I'm going to try to put it all together for us. And the whole issue of the TB treatment R&D goal. We want to develop some treatment combinations of new and repurposed medications, and we want to make sure that it treats all forms of tuberculosis, including those in children, and all those things that we've been talking about along here: effective, safe, quick, simple. And the issue is that we want to ensure that these treatments are available to all, but what do we need for that? And that is, you need a drug pipeline, and we can see here already, what we've heard today, that we don't have that pipeline, which is why we're starting to go upstream. Increased investment, of course, an open collaborative R&D approach, and good affordability and sustainable access provisions. So what I'm going to concentrate on is this concept of the open collaboration. I think the stage has already been set during this presentation, during these presentations. We know the problems. The underfunding in tuberculosis research is that, we have just less than 1/3 of the money that we need to do this. We know that pharmaceutical companies are not interested because, as was pointed out earlier, you have 1 million people on antiretrovirals. There's a market there because they're all in the U.S., right? But then we think about tuberculosis and where are these patients? They're all, most of them are in poor countries, and they're poorest of the poor within these countries. In terms of the market failure, we have the wrong patients in the wrong place. That's just what I just mentioned. The pipeline. There's 7 drugs. This Chan mentioned, the 2, bedaquiline, delamanid, and now we've been talking about Sutezolid all along here. So we obviously need more drugs. So the issue that went on with malaria, the disease that you had mentioned, that this is not the issue. We need more information in order to even move the road forward. And this whole issue that we've all heard of the silo development, for example, bedaquiline, delamanid, individual compounds at the FDA in the United States, we can't use them, legally in trials because they haven't been tested together. So that's a problem. That's not part of the TB regimen. And then Sutezolid, we've just heard all through the line, and basically we have, although there's been some progress now in this year, but this compound is not yet to the point where we can actually use it. So the solution is the Life Prize. And our mission here is to actually develop something that's affordable, develop something that's short course, and that's effective, as I said, for all forms of tuberculosis, which we all know is now the deadliest infectious disease killer, surpassing HIV. So we need this innovative financing enabling framework, and the prize consists of the following. It's prize funding for drugs entering clinical trials with some predetermined criteria, which I will describe in a second. There's going to be some additional grant funding to finance the development of a pan-TB regimen in line with the target regimen profiles. All funding is going to require, this is the whole point of this session, intellectual property and the data management to ensure that we have the collaboration, fair licensing, and ensure access and stewardship concerns that are addressed throughout the whole lifeline. This is just a visualization of what I was just describing at the, let's see, is there some? Okay, so basically at the beginning, you see these 3 dots, 3 dots, 3 dots, and those are the drugs that are in preclinical.
One of them is a pointer.
Is it?
That one there.
This one?
Yeah.
Ah, yes, okay. If we're looking here, okay, these are all of the things that we need, some drugs that are being, but are they the good ones? That's the first question. The awarding of this prize is going to be contingent on having a good compound. And this good compound has to fulfill 3 criteria. This is going to be based on the target product profiles, which looks at things like formulation, the drug interactions, can we have something that's a non-injectable, the drugs have to work with antiretrovirals, for example. So that's the thing. The second thing is this whole, we've been discussing this time, is the whole issue of the intellectual property pooling using the medicine patent pool. So only the drugs that are going to be using this pool is going to be actually eligible for this. And the third thing is all the data have to be shared. Okay, so that's the first thing. So when is this life prize going to be given? It's given at this point, right here. And it has to fulfill all the criteria, and phase 1 is where the prize is going to be given. And hopefully there are going to be other funders other than the ones that are in the framework for the compound itself. The phase 2 onwards is going to be only regimens. It's not going to be individual drugs. It's going to be actually have to be regimens that are working towards the target regimen profile, and this will be funded either by the Life Prize or other grant funders within the Life Prize framework. And this prize is not just open to pharmaceutical companies, it's open to academics, which is why we were hearing about the whole the university piece, academic institutions, biotech industries, and pharmaceutical companies. So representatives from all these organizations from Washington have been consulted, and they are in agreement with the design of this prize. So what are we trying to, I should mention, what are we talking about in terms of money? What's that prize going to be consisting of? So that people don't have to, organizations don't have to feel they have to recoup their investments after the fact. The first prize is around $30 million at that point where I had that star. And the idea is over the next 10 years, this is a $1.5 to $2 billion project. This is very, very aspirational, and that we'd have 15 to 18 prizes. So it's a significant amount of money. As I said, this is still very, very aspirational, and we hope that we can get to the end. So overcoming gaps in this landscape, we have that preclinical development here. And then the Life Prize will be given, again, at this point, over the current hurdle to get the compounds from that preclinical development to this phase here. Then we have the whole issue of the pooling of data, and the intellectual property, which we're going to facilitate this regimen development, increase the grant funds, and then there are multiple funders working towards this goal. And finally, we have the point of where we then enter the market, and so the regulators that are involved in this process, WHO involvement is key. It's going to ensure that there are going to be appropriate trials for these for this guideline process. So there's an timely issuing of guidelines, and then medicines will be made through this whole concept of generic production. So the question is, who is the Life Prize? I mean, what does this constitute? It's a bunch of organizations. These are the members that are here already, but we hope we have many more. Obviously, Stop TB Partnership and the World Health Organization that are very involved in the whole TB. We've mentioned already the Medicines Patent Pool, the Critical Path Institute, but we also have government that's involved. The South Africa government is involved, and also we have involvement from India, the union, the organization that I represent. We're actually being housed as the Secretariat, TB Alliance, and also civil society. So in terms of the bigger picture, we're not the only game in town. We're going to be complementary to other TB R&D work, and they're mentioned here. And the idea is that we will incentivize all the actors that I already mentioned, the academic institutes, the biotech institutes, and also the pharmaceutical companies. The whole idea is, which is clear to everyone here, is that we're going to speed up the clinical trial development by streamlining the process and ensuring this open model of data and IP sharing. Now, the issue of affordable treatment is going to hopefully will be addressed, because why? We're going to give the money up front, and so by the time it's ready for production, then the people don't have to recoup their investments. And it provides a proof of concept for a new way of incentivizing this research and development, and especially in the whole context of the bigger context of the antimicrobial antimicrobial resistance discussions. This is already on the agenda for 2 key meetings in the TB community, which is the ministerial meeting in Moscow, which will happen in November of this year, and the UN General Assembly meeting, high-level meeting that will happen in 2018, hopefully. I don't think it's been totally decided, but September is the goal. And even this year, in May, when the G20 Ministers of Health got together, this concept was mentioned in the memorandum that came out, and then at the Heads of State meeting also. So we're actually moving in a good way. This is much more momentum than we've had before in the whole TB space. So with that, I'm hoping, again, this is an aspirational idea. It sounds like we've gotten the basics in place to get this moving, and then we'll be working on this for hopefully the next 10 years. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Just to let you know, as I say, Grania is the real mover and shaker, and I want to really credit her for all the work that she's done, and I'm here today as the messenger.
Thank you. I was also going to acknowledge Grania as one of the key people behind this session, so I'm sorry that she's not here. We have 2 or 3 minutes for some final comments, so any takers? There better be, otherwise I'll take the 3 minutes. No. Well, let me go to the speakers. What about last comment from you, Jan?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Life Prize presentation summed it up all together nicely. If we can get R&D moving and done in the correct way from the start, and importantly, get government and other funders committed to investing in this type of approach, then I think we can see real change in the next few years.
Good. Deborah, you want a last comment?
Yeah, I think I would just, Mel Spiegelman said the other day, the Life Prize is a wonderful concept, but it's in its infancy. I think we've pulled together all the right pieces and parts, but that investment is really important, and that really needs to happen so we can kick off these different prizes.
I think collaboration, transparency, sharing of data is really important. I also realize I want to recognize the people who are sort of the activists in the room as well, that coalitions work and that we should continue to do this to push for access and innovation in the areas that we need to.
You want one more go? No? I think, one must be forgiving in this whole endeavor, because there's been complete failure on TB drugs, from new drug discovery all through to, access. And the bunch of people in this room and outside are trying to do is to build another pathway to address this and I'm sure there'll be lots of mistakes made along the way, but the other system hasn't worked, right? So we've got to find a way to do it. But what's important for the TB community, and I think you're going to be annoyed with always wanting to take lessons from the HIV world, but get annoyed. Unless there's a solid core of people that pay attention to this, you might end up with having new drug regimens, new diagnostics, a new definition of infection, all those things, and it might not make the kinds of differences. This is the work that's needed to bring those drugs to the patients who need them on a scale that you all want to see. Did you have your hand up? Okay, well then you get the last say.
Question. So, Philip de Croix Burnett Institute. It was a question to the last speaker. So I'm just trying to clarify, was your presentation information sharing, in which case it's fantastic and exciting and very aspirational, or was there a specific ask to people in the audience? And if so, what was it?
It was my understanding from Grania that I was supposed to pull this whole idea together after having asked, having been told about the medicines patent pool, it's more like, how do we go about doing it? I don't know if all the correct people are in the room that can actually advance the cause and getting us the money. Those discussions are happening at other levels. So it was more from my understanding, was to pull it all together.
And the ask is, with all of the people doing all the wonderful work on new drug regimens, to buy into the system. That's the ask. And at least, if they take us here, Sutezolid related regimens might be sort of a way to get this going off the ground. But you know better.
Well, I think one of my marching orders from this session, frankly, is, again, we've got 2 different research tracks for Sutezolid. Why they can't be a part of this as a proof of concept, rather than setting up their own committee, in the case of TBA for Sutezolid, I don't know. It just doesn't make sense. So, I'm sorry, but to benefit from public funding requires a certain consciousness that you consider the product of your R&D a public good. In this case, they received the molecule from the MPP. In RM's case, if they get the funding, it's funding from Unidaid. There is an inherent responsibility in that to provide affordability and accessibility. So why not the Life Prize? Also, just to talk about the socialism on data, it's just kind of interesting. So MPP, the MOU, is it signed? Okay, so Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, they require recipients of their R&D funding to provide the data. So this is becoming a norm. Obviously, what Life Prize and what Critical Path is providing is that critical path. What a good name. Did you focus group that? That's just brilliant. So in any case, Sutezolid is a test of not just the concept, but frankly, the consciousness and the will towards having access at the forefront now. It's an old drug. It's like enough already.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you very much for your attention. I was a bit worried when the TB Alliance and Grania's replacement were not here at the beginning. But I think you agree with me that we've been served very well by our presenters. So you'll join me to thank them, and thank you for your participation in this.